Reluctant to leave the area, I spent the night in Blackheath, a pretty little town in the woods a dozen miles farther down the highway. My last view from my motor window before turning in was a car passing slowly on the highway, its headlamps like searchlights, and the world settled under a thick eider-down of murk. It didn't look terribly promising. So you may imagine my surprise when I awoke in the morning to find bright sunshine spilled across my bed and filling the tops of the trees outside. I opened the door to a golden world so bright it made me blink. Birds were singing in the exotic tones of the bush. I wasted not a moment getting back to Katoomba. The view when I returned to Echo Point was outstanding. A broad veil of very green forest broken at intervals by square-topped outcrops and fractured pinnacles, the whole filled with a vast and imposing silence. The sky was a rich and all but cloudless blue. Even at 9 in the morning you could tell it was going to be a really hot day. I spent 90 minutes or so walking along the cliff top, enjoying the view from various angles. I had a look at Katoomba Falls and the stranded sandstone uprights known as the Three Sisters, and at length, entirely satisfied, wandered back into town for coffee. In the 1930s and 1940s, Katoomba was a popular retreat for people of a genteel and discriminating nature. It was much less roughish than Bondi or the other beach outposts, where there was always a danger that young Bruce and Noeline might be exposed to more flesh than was healthy at their ages, or overhear strong language, men saying jisms and struth and so on. Katoomba offered more refined pursuits, strolls through the woods, a therapeutic dip in a hydro pool, orchestral dancing in the evenings. Today, Katoomba clings with a slight air of desperation to its bygone glory. Its main street had a generous sprinkling of Art Deco buildings, notably a wonderful old movie house, though several, including the movie house, were closed. I bought a morning newspaper and found my way into a cafe. It always amazes me how seldom visitors bother with local papers. Personally, I can think of nothing more exciting, certainly nothing you could do in a public place with a cup of coffee, than to read newspapers from a part of the world you know almost nothing about. What a comfort it is to find a nation preoccupied by matters of no possible consequence to oneself. I love reading about scandals involving ministers of whom I have never heard, murder hunts in communities whose names sound dusty and remote, features on revered artists and thinkers whose achievements have never reached my ears, whose talents I must take on faith. I love, above all, to venture into the color supplements and see what's fashionable for the beach in this part of the world, what's new for the kitchen, what I might get for my money if I had 400,000 Australian dollars and the reason to live in double or woolloomoodloo. There is something about all this that feels privileged, almost illicit, like going through a stranger's drawers. Where else can you get this much pleasure for a handful of coins? At this time, I was following with some devotion a libel trial in which two government ministers were suing a publisher over a book containing scurrilous and, as it proved, groundless allegations implying sexual indiscretions in times gone by. With each passing day, the trial had taken on the most exhilarating air of farce. Just recently, a former leader of the opposition had taken the stand, and for no reason that any sane person could deduce, had begun recounting lively stories of alleged sexual improprieties by other ministers who were not remotely connected to the book or trial. But what had attracted me to the case in the first place, and what made it all seem particularly special, was the simple happy coincidence that the two ministers at the heart of the affair were named Abbott and Costello. So I was sitting happily absorbed in this when I heard a familiar voice say quite loudly and in a discontented tone, "This isn't strawberry jam, it's black currant." I looked up to see my two little old friends from the day before. They were looking much smaller and frailer with their hats and coats and scarves off. These items, neatly folded, were stacked high on the chairs beside them, as if awaiting transfer to a linen cupboard. I wondered if perhaps they were all those clothes, not so much for warmth as because all the dressing and undressing helped them fill their days. "They haven't got strawberry, dear," said the wife in a quieter voice. The lady explained, They only have black currant or marmalade." "Well, I don't want either." "Then don't have either." This said with just a hint of wailiness. "But it's on my toast." "No, dear, that's my toast. I ordered you a jam donut." "Jam donut? Jam donut? Are you mad? I don't like jam donuts. This tea is cold." I lowered myself back into my paper, but on the way out I stopped to bid my elderly friends goodbye. The man clearly didn't have any very real notion who I was. The jam donut, I noticed, had been devoured. Only a small purple dollop gleamed on the plate before him. "It's the young man from Echo Point," the woman explained, but her husband was too busy chasing the dollop of jam with a spoon to pay me any heed. "I see the weather's cleared," I observed cheerfully. "Often happens like that," the man said in a small shout, without looking up. I said it wouldn't last 36 hours. "We had an experience just like it at Banbury once," the wife said to me. "Terrible fog, and then all of a sudden it came out all lovely and clear. Do you remember that, dear?" "Quite," said the old man distractedly. Coaxing the elusive jam aboard with a forefinger, he lifted the spoon and bunched it in his mouth with a look of immense satisfaction. "Quite." And so once more to the wandering road. Beyond Blackheath, the highway began a steep and curvaceous descent towards Ligo, Ligo, where it skirted along the hem of the mountains before striking off cross-country through grassy plains towards the country town of Bathurst. I was now in the rural heartlands in an area known to geology as the Murray-Darling Basin. The fields on all sides were filled with tall blonde grass, which waved in a languid manner, and there were buttercups in the verges, the whole bathed in the sweetest, brightest sunlight. Here and there stately trees shaded a white farmhouse. There wasn't a gum tree in sight. I could almost have been in the American Midwest. The welcoming world I was passing into now wasn't quite as virginal as Blaxland and his cronies had supposed when they first gazed down on it from the heights behind them. When the first settlers stepped from the wooded mountains, they were startled to find herds of cows numbering in the hundreds, grazing contentedly on the tall grasses, all offsprings of the ones that had wandered off from Sydney Cove all those years before. The cows, it transpired, had gone around the mountains through an open pass to the south. Why it had not occurred to a human being in 25 years to try to do likewise is a question that is rarely asked and has yet to be satisfactorily answered. Nor were the fertile plains quite as boundless as had at first been supposed. Good grazing land extended only a few score miles inland from the coast, and even that was subject to the dispiriting vagaries of nature. It still is. 100 miles or so north of where I was driving now, on the edge of this grassy zone, stands the little town of Ningan. In 1989, 1990, 1992, 1995, 1996, and 1998, it was devastated by torrential flash floods. For 5 years during the same period, while Ningan was repeatedly inundated, the town of Koba, just 80 miles to the west, recorded not a drop of rain. This is, if I hadn't made it clear already, one tough country. And yet, the striking thing about this area was how thoroughly delightful and accommodating it appeared. The farms were neat and trim, and the towns I passed through gave every air of a comfortable prosperity. It was impossible to believe that a metropolis of 4 million people lay just over the hills behind. I felt as if I had stumbled into some forgotten, magically self-contained world. There were things out here I hadn't seen in years. Gas stations with old-fashioned pumps and no canopies over the forecourt, so that you pumped your gas in full sun, as I am sure God intended it. Metal windmills of the sort that used to stand in every Kansas farm field. Little towns with people in them. People going about their business, greeting each other with a smile and a nod. It all had a familiarity about it, but the familiarity of something half forgotten. Gradually, it dawned on me that I was in the American Midwest, but it was the American Midwest of long ago. I was, in short, in the process of making the marvelous and heartwarming discovery that outside the cities it is still 1958 in Australia. Hardly seems possible, but there you are. I was driving through my childhood. Partly it was to do with that dazzling light. It was the kind of pure, undiffused light that can come only from a really hot blue sky, the kind that makes even a concrete highway painful to behold and turns every distant reflective surface into a little glint of flame. Do you know how sometimes on very fine days the sun will shine with a particular intensity that makes the most mundane objects in the landscape glow with an unusual radiance, so that buildings and structures you normally pass without a glance suddenly become arresting, even beautiful? Well, they seem to have that light in Australia nearly all the time. It took me a while to recognize that this was precisely the light of summers, Iowa's summers from my boyhood, and it was a shock to realize just how long it had been since I had seen it. Partly, too, it was to do with the road. Almost all Australian highways are still just 2 lanes wide, and what the difference that makes. You're not cut off from the wider world as you are on a superhighway, but part of it, intimately connected. All the million details of the landscape are there beside you, up close, not blurred into some distant, tediously epic backdrop. It changes your whole outlook. There's no point in hurrying when all it's going to do is put you in the feathery wake of that old chicken truck half a mile ahead. Might as well hold back and enjoy the scenery. So there's none of that mad, pointless urgency. Gotta pass this guy, gotta keep pushing, gotta make some miles. That makes any drive on an interstate such as such an exhausting and unsatisfying business. When you come to a town on such a road, it is an event. You don't fly through at speed, but slow down and glide through in a stately manner, like a float in a parade, slow enough to nod to pedestrians if you wish, and to check out the goods in the windows on Main Street. Oh, that's a good price on men's double knit shirt, you observe in a thoughtful tone, or those lawn chairs were cheaper in Bathurst, or needless to say, you're talking to yourself by now. Sometimes, quite often, in fact, you stop for coffee and browse around the shops. Afterward, you return to the open road, and naturally at first you go a little too fast, for speed is an instinct. But then, whoops, you round a bend to find yourself fast approaching the back of a dump truck, kicking out smoke and laboring heavily up a slope. So you drop back and take it easy. You lean an arm on a windowsill, lay a finger on the wheel and cruise. You hadn't done this for years. You hadn't been on a drive like this since you were a kid. You'd forgotten motoring could be fun. I loved it. As if to underscore the agreeably retro nature of the driving experience in Australia, I began to discover that radio stations in country towns specialize in songs from yesteryear. I don't mean songs from the 60s and 70s, but much earlier. This may be the last country in the world where you can turn on the car radio and stand a more than passing chance of hearing Peggy Lee or Julie London, possibly even Giselle Mackenzie, whose popularity in the 1950s can only be attributed to a winning smile and the luck to live in the undiscriminating age. It would be intemperate to make a sweeping generalization about rural Australian radio stations because I listened to no more than 6 or 7,000 hours of them in the time I was there, so I might have missed something good, but I will say this. When our modern monuments have crumbled to dust, when the careless hand of time has worn away all traces of the 20th century, you can be certain that somewhere in an Australian country town there will be a disc jockey saying, "And that was Doris Day with her classic hit Que Sera Sera." I even loved that too, for a week or so. And so, by such happy means did I proceed through Lithgow, Bathurst, Blayney, and Lyndhurst, and finally, in mid-afternoon, fetched up in Kola, a compact and tidy community of 8,207 people in the Lachlan Valley on the Lachlan River, both named, of course, for our old friend Mr. Macquarie. I knew nothing about Cora, but I quickly learned that it is well known to Australians as the site of the infamous Cora breakout. During World War II, a large prisoner of war camp stood just outside Cora. One side held 2,000 Italian prisoners of war. On the other side were 2,000 Japanese. The Italians were model prisoners. At overcoming the mortification of finding themselves taken from the front lines and transported to a distant sunny land far from the roar of guns, they settled down and made the best of things. So gamely did they cover their disappointment that one might almost have thought they welcomed the new situations. They worked on local farms and were only lightly guarded. Their officers, I just love this, weren't guarded at all. They were free to come and go as they pleased and asked only to close the door behind them to keep out the flies. Regularly they could be seen strolling into Kola for cigarettes and newspapers, possibly an aperitif at the Lachlan Hotel. The Japanese presented a somber contrast. They refused to undertake work or offer any measure of cooperation. Most gave false names, so deep was the shame of capture. Ridiculously and tragically, in August 1944, in the middle of the night, 1,100 of them staged a suicidal mass breakout, bursting from their barracks with the banzai cry and charging en masse at the guard tower, clutching baseball bats, chair legs, and whatever other weapons they could contrive. The startled guards poured bullets into the mass but were quickly overwhelmed. Within minutes, 300 78 prisoners had escaped into the countryside. Quite what they expected to do out there is anyone's guess. It took 9 days to round them all up. The farthest any of them had gotten was 15 miles. The Japanese casualties were 231 killed and 112 wounded. The Australians suffered 3 killed that night and 4 during the hunt afterwards. All this is commemorated in photographs and other displays at Koura's visitors center, which in itself was excellent, but in the room at the back was a small audio-visual theater that was one of the most enchanting things I believe I had ever seen. Certainly ever seen in a small country town in the middle of nowhere. Behind the glass on a kind of small stage were objects saved from the prisoners of war camp, some books and diaries, a couple of framed photographs, a baseball bat and gloves, a medicine bottle, a Japanese board game. As I entered, the lights automatically dimmed in the room. A little introductory music played, and then, this was the enchanting part, a young woman about 6 inches high stepped out of one of the framed photographs and began moving around among the objects and talking about Koura in the 1940s and the prison breakout. My mouth fell open. She didn't just move about, but interacted with the objects, stepped around books, idly leaned on a shelf casing as she went through her presentation. As you can imagine, I got up and had a closer look, and I can tell you that no matter how close you got to the glass, and I had my head pressed against it, the way children do when they wish to be amusing. You couldn't see the artifice. She was a perfectly formed, full-color, charmingly articulate, rather dishy, 3-dimensional person right in front of me and only 6 inches high. It was the most captivating thing I had seen in years. It was obvious that it was a film projected in some way from beneath, but that wasn't a stutter or bump, no scratchy lines or wiggly hairs. It was as real as an image can get. She was a perfect little hologram. The narrative, it is worth noting, was sympathetic and informative, a model of its type. I watched it 3 times and couldn't have been more impressed. Good, hey? Beamed a lady at the reception desk, seeing the amazed look on my face when I emerged. I'll say. Anticipating my questions, she passed me a laminated card that explained how it was all done. The display was created by a company in Sydney employing an optical trick that has been around for well over a century. It was all to do with projecting an image onto a glass plate artfully positioned in such a way to become invisible to the spectator. Beyond that, the only real trick was taking fastidious care that the actress hit her marks exactly. It must have taken months. It was simply brilliant. And I will say this, when they figure a way to get that little person to lap dance, they will make a fortune. I ended the day at Yang, a farming town in plum and cherry country 40 miles down the Olympic Highway from Koura in the direction of Canberra. I got the room in a motel on the side street not far from the town center. The owner, a fit-looking fellow in shorts and a short-sleeved shirt, read my name off the registration card and said, "Good day, Bill. Welcome to Young," and gave my hand a powerful shake as if inducting me into a secret society. The friendliness of Australians, all of it quite sincere and spontaneous as far as I could ever tell, never ceases to amaze or gratify. I had never had a motelia pump my hand before or act so pleased that fate had thrown us together. "Glad to have you," he went on, still pumping away. My name's Bruce," or whatever it was, for I was too disarmed in every sense to catch it. "Well, good day, Bruce," I stammered uncertainly. "I'm Bill." "Yes, Bill, we've established that," he said, and dropped my hand abruptly. "You're in room 6. I took my key to my room, opened the door, and stepped in. The room was in every tiny, particular degree from 1958. I don't mean that it had not been decorated since 1958 or anything remotely disrespectful. I mean that inside that room it was 1958. The walls are paneled in knotty pine. The TV had the UHF dial on it. The toilet seat had been gift-wrapped with a sanitized for your convenience wrapper. In a drawer in the bedroom were 2 complimentary postcards featuring views of the motel and a paper bag into which I was urged for my further convenience to place unflashable objects. The bag bore a drawing of a woman to tip us off, presumably that it is intended for female personal things rather than, say, corn cobs or small engine parts, and she could almost have passed for June Cleaver. I could not have been happier. I dumped my stuff and walked into town through the baking end-of-day heat. Now I saw the 1950s everywhere. Even the children crossing signs in Australia, I noticed, show kids in 1950s attire. A little girl in a party dress, a boy in short pants like Dick and Jane in silhouette. Superficially, Young didn't look terribly much like the towns I had grown up with. The exceptionally wide streets. They love really wide streets in Australian country towns. The red tin roofs, the metal sidewalk marquees that run like hat rings around every commercial building. All this was indubitably Australian, but in the way it worked and what it contained, Young was uncannily familiar. This was a place where, when you had an errand to run, you drove into town, not out of it, and parked in an angled slot on Main Street. This alone was enough to hold me transfixed for some minutes. I had forgotten that there was a time when a little parking along Main Street was all a community needed. I walked around in a state of the profoundest admiration. Except for the banks and the supermarket, the business were locally owned, with all the peculiarities of taste and presentation that implies. There were shops here of types I hadn't seen in years. Fix-it shops and little electrical shops, bakeries, cobblers, tea rooms, and sometimes they sold the most extraordinary combination of goods. At the far end of the main street, I came across one place so exceptional in this respect that it stopped me in my tracks. It was a shop that sold pet supplies and pornography. I am quite serious. I stood back to stare at the sign, then peered through the window and finally stepped inside. It was a smallish shop, and I was the only customer. On a raised platform about halfway back sat a man beside the cash register reading a newspaper. He didn't say hello or make any acknowledgement, which seemed odd, very un-Australian, until I realized he was being discreet. I imagine most of his customers do what I was doing now, wander around showing an unwanted contemplative interest in catnip and flea powders, pausing from time to time to study the labels on canisters of fish flakes and the like, before ending up entirely by accident at the back of the shop in a heavy breathing section. Remarkably, this is what happened to me now. The adult section was partitioned into a little compound with admission through a wooden gate. As I stood there, the gate made a small electronic buzz, the kind of buzz that is made in office buildings when the door is opened from a remote location and swung to in a provocative manner. I looked around, surprised. The man was still, to all appearances, absorbed in his newspaper. He seemed unaware that I was even in his shop, much less on the threshold of porno heaven. I grinned foolishly and thought about approaching him to explain that he had just made a quite understandable but nonetheless comical error, that I, far from being a desperate pervert in need of pictorial nutrition, was in fact a respectable trouble writer drawn to his shop by the unusual juxtaposition of its contents. Then we would have a good laugh and possibly strike up a correspondence. But then it occurred to me that if I did buy something, I am not suggesting for a moment that I would, but on the other hand, I still had nothing for the kids. I probably wouldn't want my business card pinned to his bulletin board. It also occurred to me that I had a certain duty to find out if there was some unexpected connection between the two strands of his business. Perhaps petting had a whole different meaning in rural Australia, to say nothing of dog fancier. For all I knew, the racks beyond the barrier were full of publications with frisky, animalistic titles, prime mounts, whip and color, sheep-dip frolics. Who could say? Clearly I had a duty to find out, so I resumed my expression of sober perusal and stepped inside. I had never actually been in one of these places before, and by that I don't mean a pet supply porno parlor. I mean any kind of adult enclosure, and frankly I was shocked. The participants were human, not animal. More than that I am unwilling to specify. It certainly wasn't 1958 at the back of the pet food shop in Young. That's all I'm saying.